Welcome back to the King's Corner, the place for all things Bethesda. I am the KingFanMan. We continue our search for the scariest places in Fallout 76. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at the most documented ghost in West Virginia history. We're going to Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Greenbrier County, West Virginia is the second largest county in West Virginia with 1,021 square miles of land and was created in March of 1778 from portions of Montgomery County and a portion of Virginia. It was named for its largest and primary river, the Greenbrier. Lewisburg is the county seat and is located in the south central part of the state. Also located in the county is the world-famous White Sulphur Springs and the Greenbrier Hotel and Spa. It's a mostly rural county, beautiful just as most of the other West Virginia counties. It is nestled in the Allegheny Mountains and filled with the charm of the country lifestyle. The leading industries have been and are still today coal, timber, and agriculture, including livestock, dairy farms, poultry, and even orchards. It is almost postcard perfect, but life, sadly, is often much harder than that picture postcard makes it look. Even though Greenbrier County, West Virginia can be beautiful on the surface, just like anywhere else, it's had its troubles, and maybe even greater than some. It just happens to be the home of the most documented ghost account in West Virginia's history. No, this is not an ordinary ghost story. In 1873, just after one of the most troubling times in American history had hit Greenbrier County, the scars of the Civil War still being seen and felt all around the area, Elva Zona Hester was born. She grew up very poor, around Richland, West Virginia. She had a very troubled youth, but sadly, her story was not going to be a very happy one, even as she grew older. In 1895, she was with child and eventually gave birth, but she had no husband, nor would the father ever be a part of her life or the child's life. In October the very next year, 1896, Zona soon became enamored with a man who had just moved to Greenbrier County. He was a very handsome man, a blacksmith named Erasmus Trout Shue. But once everyone got to know him, they all called him Trout. Trout also had a very troubled past, so many thought that they were a great match. He had been married twice before, but the troubling part about his past was that those wives died in very strange circumstances. One wife fell from a haystack. The other was struck by a falling brick from a chimney that Trout himself was working on. Trout also had been in prison for stealing a horse. Of course, in modern time, that would be like stealing a car or Grand Theft Auto. Now, in that time period, Zona's situation of having a child out of wedlock and Trout's situation of being married twice before were both very much looked down upon, and most would not have gotten into a relationship with either of them. So as the old phrase goes, they deserved one another. That was basically everyone's attitude. That is, except for Zona's mother. She didn't trust Trout from the beginning. Mary Jane Hester was her name, and she even questioned later how his wives may have died, and they may have even been killed by him, she thought. But regardless of her objections, they fell in love, and they were very soon married. In fact, their courtship lasted only a few months. They were married on October the 20th, 1896 at the Old Methodist Church in Live Say's Mill. They moved into a small 2-story frame home and seemed to be happy, at least for a short time. But it didn't take long for Zona's mother's worst fears to materialize. Zona fell ill around Christmas, but the family doctor, J.M. Knapp, could never diagnose what was wrong. However, he did suspect she might be pregnant again. She had started feeling a little better in January, getting out of bed and trying to get back to normal, doing her daily routines. But now her mother and her doctor were both concerned about her well-being, both thinking something just wasn't quite right. Things seemed to settle down through January with Zona, but now even her friends noticed that she seemed to have lost her happiness. But most just assumed that she was still not feeling very well. However, on a frigid morning near the end of the month, January 22nd, 1897 to be exact, Trout Shue left the home headed for work, but he stopped off by the house of Martha Jones, who they fondly called Aunt Martha. Trout asked if Martha's son, 11-year-old Andy, could pick up some eggs for his wife and go check on her since she had been sick and he was going to work. Now this sounded like a very loving request of a husband who was concerned about his ailing wife. However, Trout got much more odd as the day went on. Trout would return to Martha's house 4 times that day to see if Andy had gone to his house to check on his wife yet. The young boy had been very busy helping the doctor that morning, and every time Trout would return, he would repeat the request and get more impatient and angry. Well, it seems he could have gone and checked on his own wife with all the time that he wasted at Martha's house. Why did he want this 11-year-old boy to go to his house instead of going and checking on her himself? Finally, the 11-year-old Andy made it to the Shue house around 1 o'clock. What the poor boy found was horrific. He found a trail of blood that led to the lifeless body of Zona that was laying at the bottom of the stairway. Her head slightly tilted to one side, her feet stretched out together, one hand on her stomach, and one hand at her side. The young boy, in a panic, ran and told his mother and Mr. Shue. Both ran back to the house, and they sent word for Dr. Knapp. It took Dr. Knapp around an hour to get to the home. Upon his arrival, the doctor was completely shocked to find the body not only moved from the spot of death, but also redressed and already laid out as if for burial. Now, this was extremely odd, to say the least, and it had the doctor in total dismay. Trout Shue was already grieving over the body, as one would do today in a funeral home. Zona had on a gorgeous dress with a very high collar, buttoned all the way to the top of her chin. Trout had her hands laid on her chest, just like she was ready for the grave, not an examination. Trying to set aside his dismay, the doctor tried some basic medical reviving, but he found the body was already cold, so he turned to trying to find out what had caused her death. But he was finding this task very, very difficult because of Trout's behavior. Dr. Knapp did notice some discoloration on her right cheek and neck. However, when he began to loosen the high, tight collar of her dress, her husband protested and became very upset, wanting the doctor to stop touching his wife's body. Later admitting that he was intimidated and even a little scared of Trout Shue, Dr. Knapp stopped the examination at this point and declared Zona's cause of death to be due to heart failure, although in the county death register, her cause of death was listed as childbirth. Zona's body was soon in a casket at her home for the viewing, but Trout's odd behavior continued. Now, most everyone just assumed it was probably just a very bereaved husband. Trout never left his wife's body, He would never let anyone get close to her face or head. He also took a large white cloth and rolled it up tight and placed it around the back of her head, placing it very tightly on each side of her neck, and he explained to everyone this was to make her more comfortable. After her wake, her body was taken to the Soul Chapel Cemetery and buried. Now, this might seem like an end to the story, but for this strange tale, it's really just about to get very, very interesting. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, still had major concerns about Trout Shue with his past 2 wives, and now his actions around her daughter's death had made her suspicions run rampant. She just could not believe that her daughter's death was an accident. And adding to her suspicions, just before her daughter's body was put in the ground, Mary had asked Trout if she could have the piece of cloth that he had used to prop her head. Well, he had begrudgingly allowed her to have it. Well, several days after the funeral, she noticed that this garment that he had put around her neck was giving off a terrible odor. Well, she placed the cloth in a wash basin, and the water turned red like blood. Now, why had this garment that had been around her daughter's neck, why did it have blood all over it? She tried to wash the sheet, but no matter how many times she washed it, she could not get the stain out. So it was definitely blood on the sheet. This further confused her and made her suspicions even deeper. All she knew to do now was to pray. In fact, for 4 weeks she prayed, but no answers would come. In fact, she wondered if any answers would ever come to her questions. What happened to her daughter? However, one night in February, someone was listening. Mary was praying just as she always did, but she was disturbed by a strange noise in her room. However, she knew she was alone. She was alone in her room, in fact, alone in her whole house. She peeked out from beside her bed where she had been kneeling, and she was shocked to see a young woman walking around in her room. She later said that she almost instantly recognized the figure as her deceased daughter, Zona. She got so excited that she tried to reach out and touch her, but she instantly disappeared when her hand touched the figure. Now you can imagine her mother's heart is beating so fast. Her emotions are running wild. She just saw her daughter who had just died. Her tears are flowing. She wants her daughter to come back and tell her what had happened to her. All she knew to do was fall to her knees and beg and plead for her daughter to come back and tell her. In fact, that's what she did. She prayed the rest of the night for her daughter to come back and tell her what had happened to her. And that's exactly what happened. In fact, according to Greenbrier County official records, yes, you heard me right. According to Greenbrier County official records, her daughter came back 4 more times and gave her more information than she could have ever imagined having, telling her exactly what happened on the night she passed away. Now, could this really be true? Could the ghost of Zona Shue really have come back to her mother 4 times and given the details of her murder? Well, as I said, it is public record in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. You can still go and read about it today. You can go look it up. It's on the books in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. There is more to this magnificent story. In fact, we'll get into the very details about those 4 nights where she appeared to her mother. But as I say, the story continues. Mary Jane excitedly started telling everyone she knew, friends and family, that her daughter had come to see her and told her that she was murdered by her husband. Well, of course, everyone thought she was crazy and had lost her mind. But finally, her brother-in-law, Jonathan Hester, at least started listening to her story. As Mary Jane started laying out what Zona had told her those 4 nights, he was finally convinced enough that he and Mary Jane made their way to Lewisburg and talked to John A. Preston, the prosecuting attorney. Now, I can just imagine what the prosecuting attorney must have thought when Jonathan and Mary Jane came in with a story about a ghost telling about their own murder. However, once Jonathan started laying out the evidence in this case, it did get his attention. In fact, it got his attention enough that he reached out to Dr. Knapp, the doctor that first did the examination on Zona right after she had passed away. And he admitted that he was unable to conduct a good examination of the body because of Mr. Shue's behavior. In fact, there were many irregularities surrounding her death and with his behavior. Well, this definitely got his attention and made John A. Preston, the prosecuting attorney, look deeper into this case. It wasn't very long until he ordered on February the 22nd, 1897, the body of Zona Shue to be dug up for autopsy. Now, when Trout Shue heard about the order for autopsy, he was very troubled. However, he boasted to the media that he would be arrested, but that he would never be convicted in the court of law. Now, that is a very strange boast before the body was ever examined. When they examined the body of Zona, they found that her neck was broken between the first and second vertebrae. Also, she had torn ligaments, and her windpipe was also crushed in the front. And yes, Trout Shue was arrested immediately. Court would convene on June the 22nd, 1897 at the Lewisburg courthouse. It was State versus Trout Shue for murder in the first degree. The only problem was the only evidence they had was circumstantial. Now, they had a lot of evidence. They had the cloth that was stained with blood that was entered into evidence. They had the body that had many, many wounds, but they had no witnesses. Or did they? John A. Preston laid out all the evidence against Trout Shue, even talking about his former 2 wives and their mysterious deaths, but he never called Mary Jane Hester to ask her about Zona appearing to her, maybe fearing how the jury might react to this kind of evidence. So the state rested and the defense started. And in an attempt to discredit the prosecution's case, the defense called Mary Jane Hester to the stand and started to ask her about Zona appearing to her. I guess they wanted the exact thing that John A. Preston feared. They thought that this might be the very thing to get Trout Shue off. But what it did was it backfired on the defense. And it turned out to be the only time, not only in West Virginian history, but the United States history that a ghost testimony has been used in the court of law to convict a person of a crime. The following is the exact transcript taken by reporters from the day of the trial, June 22nd, 1897, in Lewisburg, between defense attorney Rucker and Mrs. Mary Jane Hester. It starts out with defense attorney Rucker. I've heard that you've had some dream or vision which led to this post-mortem examination. Of course, he was trying to discredit the autopsy and get it thrown out of court. Miss Hester said, "It was no dream. She came back to me and told me." He was mad that she had no meat cooked for supper, but she said that she had plenty. She said that she had butter, she had apple butter, she had apples. She named over 2 or 3 kinds of jellies. She said, "Don't you think that he was mad and took down all my nice things, packed them away, and just ruined them all?" She told me something about that meat every night that she came to me. She came 4 more times. And the second night she came, she told me that her neck was squeezed right off at the front joint, and it was just as she told me. Now, Mrs. Hester, this sad affair was very particularly pressed upon your mind, and there was not a moment in your waking hours that you did not dwell upon it. And was this not a dream founded upon your stressed and distressed condition of mind? "Oh no, sir, it was no dream, for I was wide awake, just as I am now." "Then if it's not a dream, or dreams, then what do you call it?" Miss Hester said, "Well, I prayed to the Lord that Zona might come back and tell me what happened. I prayed that she might come herself and tell on him." "So you think that you actually saw her in flesh and blood?" "Yes, sir. I told them that she was wearing the very dress that she was killed in. And when she left me, she turned her head completely around, and she looked at me and told me that she did everything that she could to live with him in peace. And I'm satisfied that she did that too." Now, Miss Hester, don't you know that these visions, as you describe them, are nothing more than 4 dreams founded upon your distress? "No, I don't know. The Lord sent her to me to tell the truth. I was the only friend she knew. I was the only one that she could tell or put her confidence in. Plus, I was the one that was closest to her." Miss Hester, are you positively sure these were not 4 dreams? "Yes, sir. It was not a dream. I don't dream when I'm wide awake. To be sure, she was right there with me." Defense attorney Rucker said, "Now, I would like, if I could, to say that these were 4 dreams, not 4 visions or 4 appearances of your daughter in flesh and blood. That's what I need you to say." "I'm not going to say that because I'm not going to lie," Miss Hester said. "So you insist that she actually appeared to you in flesh and blood on 4 different occasions?" "Yes, sir." "Did she not have any other conversations with you other than the matter of her death?" "That's all I wanted the particulars about, her death, and I got them." Defense attorney Rucker, seeing that he was not making any headway with Mrs. Hester and probably damaging his case very bad, stopped the testimony at this point. Now, having all of this entered into evidence, the judge had no choice but to bring this up to the jury when they went in to deliberate. The jury only deliberated for 1 hour, and they found Trout Shue guilty of first-degree murder. They did, however, give him a little mercy, not sentencing him to death, but sentencing him to life in prison. 10 out of 12 jurors voted for the death penalty, but those 2 jurors saved the life of Trout Shue. However, the townspeople wanted him to be executed. In fact, a lynch mob organized only 2 days later. The sheriff and the deputies had to hide Trout Shue and sneak him onto the train that would take him to Moundsville Prison so that the lynch mob could not get him and hang him. It would only be 3 years later that Trout Shue would die in Moundsville Prison. He was buried in an unmarked grave. You know, I wonder if Zona ever visited her mother, Mary Jane Hester, again. I also wonder if Zona ever visited Trout Shue in Moundsville Prison. That would have been a meeting I would have loved to have seen. There might be one indication that she actually did visit him at Moundsville Prison. In the 3 short years that he lived there before his death, he drew a strange picture. It was him sitting in a chair with Zona standing strangely behind him. Now, why is that so strange? Because in the background, if you look closely, there are 2 coffins. One appears to be Zona's coffin. The other one appears to have a man in it, which is him. Strangely, they both are in their coffin, but yet they are both standing there. Very, very strange. And he only made it 3 years at Moundsville. And I bet those 3 years were full of torture and, yes, hauntings. I wonder if the Greenbrier Ghost is still around today. That old 2-story house of Zona and Trout Shue, it's still around today. So maybe Zona's still hanging around as well. You know, there are a lot of ghost stories out there. But today, you have heard the account of the most famous ghost in all of West Virginia and the United States. And if you don't believe me, you can go look it up for yourself.